Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective. Due to the sensitive nature of today's topic, discretion is advised for younger listeners.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a Triad production. I'm Dr. Graham Taylor, and I'm joined today by Dr. Gary Brucato. Gary is a clinical psychologist, researcher, and author in the areas of violence, early psychosis, and other serious psychopathology. He is presently an adjunct associate research scientist at Columbia University Irving Medical Center in New York City, where since 2013 he has served as the assistant director of the Center of Prevention and Evaluation, also referred to as COPE. COPE is one of a small number of worldwide research clinics dedicated to the evaluation, treatment, and study of psychosis risk. Gary is also the co-creator of the Columbia Mass Murder Database, examining mass murders worldwide since 1900. Gary has written or co-written over 50 articles and book chapters on the subjects of psychotic illness and violence, and 2 books, including The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence and Modern Violent Crime, co-authored by Dr. Michael Stone, published in 2019. He also works with Dr. Ann Burgess of Boston University, the basis for Wendy Carr on Netflix's series Mindhunter. We've seen his work in Psychology Today, The Cut, Forensic, Science Magazine, Science Daily, U.S. News and World Report, and WebMD. And when he's not engaged in these many activities, he is in his private practice at Clarity Therapy in New York City. Gary kindly joins us today in his busy life to talk about violent crime. Gary, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Behavioral Health Today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So nice to have you. You know, violent crime is not an easy topic to study. It's kind of on the darker side of our nature, the part of us that can have secretly both holding a curiosity and a revulsion around evil acts. But before we jump into this discussion on violent crime, share with us just in a nutshell, Gary, what brought you into this field?
Well, my interest originally had to do with the question of evil, because as I became more and more acquainted with clinical psychology, and was doing growing amounts of work on forensic unit or volunteering at a psychiatric hospital. There were people confined who had histories of severe violence. I was confused about how people like that could be shoehorned into existing psychiatric categories, because they were routinely referred to by staff, judges, people in the media, so forth, as quote unquote evil. And I didn't understand what it was that could drive that without having to go to the literature on theology or philosophy and so forth. And I came to be interested in bridging those two things.
Got it. You know, you're talking about a definition right there, evil, and I want to get into that in just a moment. Before we start out today, Gary, we're going to be talking about the science within this field in our talk today. And for you listeners, we're going to have Gary back to talk about some things maybe more in depth about this whole field of violence and the areas of specialty that he is truly an expert in. But Gary, as we start out today, would you please preface for us an understanding of how we should understand our talk today and where you want us to go?
Well, first and foremost, I think whenever we're talking about violent crime, it's important to understand that the reason we in a sense must go to these dark places, is in the interest of prevention of future violent crime, and to understand the psychology of offenders, not to excuse them, for example, as if they had no choice or were subject to purely biological whims in most cases or so forth, but to understand the choices people make, what the peculiar idiosyncratic logic is that drives violent crime for people. But most importantly, in my opinion, to think about victims and to help prevent future victimization. I think it's important to remember when we are thinking about any given violent crime we read about in the press or so forth, that the individual that was sort of plucked out of his or her life and drawn into this dark place by an offender was a human being who was somebody's child or loved one, friend, co-worker, and that must be driven home so that we understand the sensitivity we have to have about this kind of work.
I appreciate that. Gary, you mentioned in your own training, trying to start with and figuring out what is evil, people being referred to, in clinical settings as evil. And give us a working definition today of evil, what you've come to understand it being.
Well, I think the original concept of evil, of course, has its origins in metaphysical and religious ideas, the notion of things that are either so awful and so terrible that they must come from, sort of the dark part of spiritual life or a devil or external agent. And certainly those things, we're not here to question religious or philosophical beliefs at all. And for some religious beliefs, evil is about the absence of good. It's what isn't, right? It's choosing to do the thing that is the opposite of good or selfish or so forth. The conceptualization of evil that Michael Stone and I have used and developed has more to do with an emotional reaction than something that one chooses to do. Evil is the term that we use to refer to the way that one experiences a violent offense that is so overwhelming, shocking, horrifying, impossible to grasp, that it overrides our ability to see humanity in the offender. We cannot see that the person had a human motive because we cannot comprehend it. So the absence of the ability to understand the sheer horror, the excess, right, and the fact that universally, no matter where and when you're looking at a certain offense, it would have that reaction in people, are the hallmarks of evil acts. Now, we do not use that term to refer to people. Acts are evil. A person can commit hundreds of evil acts, but we wouldn't say a person is evil. We would say that a person is prone to acts that would meet the criteria for evil. Now, fascinatingly, in most languages, there are not separate words for bad and evil. In English, we have a word for it, and it's very important to understand the root of the word comes from the Germanic über, which means extra or over, right? Over. Now, why is that important? Because the essence of evil is that there is a pragmatic, basic, functional reason for committing an offense, but you add to it things that come from the personality needs that are not necessary for the commission of the offense. They satisfy a psychological need. So the idea is, for example, Gary Christ, a kidnapper who kidnapped Barbara Mackle, a young woman who had some ties to the Nixon family, did not simply kidnap her for ransom, which would have been the so-called pragmatic purpose of the kidnap. He additionally buried her alive in a kind of a box with air tubes and an air blower and so forth. So the idea is that extra element is what we refer to as an evil action. Whereas the pragmatic, of course, also has an evil quality to it. But the essence of evil is that extra, that unnecessary that comes from the personality.
You're really distinguishing between the two, the person and the act, and trying to understand the psychological implications of what they're doing, what's driving it. I know here that your work focuses on understanding how psychotic illness develops from vague subthreshold symptoms to frank delusions, hallucinations, and thought disorder, and how violent thoughts and actions emerge in psychotic versus non-psychotic persons. It'd be interesting for us to better understand the causes and the developmental process behind violent crime. What are some of the neurobiological and some of the psychiatric factors that you found that underlie these psychotic states and aggressiveness?
Well, it's very complicated because there is a sort of misconception in the general population that when people commit spectacular acts of violence, very large, widely reported acts of violence or truly horrendous acts that might evoke this sort of this idea of evil. There is the misconception that the person must be quote unquote deeply disturbed or very mentally ill and so forth. But it depends upon how one defines mental illness. If mental illness is used broadly to include disturbances of personality and disturbances of moral compass, or a difficulty coping with life events, then one would say that mental illness is involved in much violence. But if one confines the term to things like psychotic illness, where there are hallucinations, delusions, thought disorder, detachment from reality, disorganization of behavior, so forth, then one sees that very little violent crime is actually associated with severe mental illness. Yes. And that is true of any type of severe violence, unless one is using drugs or alcohol or not taking medication across the life. Yeah. We wouldn't expect that very much. There is some evidence that when people first develop psychosis and they're not necessarily medicated, or they first become convinced of something like the neighbors are talking about me, or the person sitting next to me has words coming out of his head that are making fun of me. An individual like that might become violent in the moment, because that is the first entry into becoming convinced of something like that at a time where there isn't necessarily intervention happening for the person. But then once the first episode closes, typically across the lifespan, people with psychosis don't tend to be violent unless they're using drugs or not taking medication. That's very unusual, or alcohol. Now, as far as the biology is concerned, there are certain brain areas, in psychopathy, right, which is the construct that has to do with this idea of being kind of sensation seeking and
Right.
bored or being guiltless, superficially charming, and so forth, that you see in some individuals. There are some suspicions about certain brain areas that may be involved, particularly the amygdala and the emotional center, the prefrontal cortex, which is known to be associated with things like inhibition and morality, and so forth.
Right.
Now, what you want to understand is the psychopathy has two subtypes. A lot of people don't realize this, that there is primary psychopathy, which is thought to be hereditary and inborn. And there is secondary psychopathy, which is where a person doesn't necessarily have the biology of a psychopath, but they are so horribly treated by life that they might do certain things adaptively, like learn to rob people or engage in prostitution or do other kinds of certain behaviors that might be considered social or criminal for the purpose of just getting by and so forth. It's certainly not an excuse, but the point being that we wouldn't expect an individual like that to necessarily have the biology. Some people believe, and I am in agreement with this, that for the worst offenders, you may need both. That it may be that if a person has the biology where the person is sensation seeking and kind of unafraid and so forth, but they had a very good upbringing, they were treated well by the world, that could be channeled into something good, like being fearless or going out into the world and doing something pro-social or being a leader. Right. But the point is that if you have the secondary factor of being treated horrendously, that those traits would then be applied towards violence. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. And it explains why it is that sometimes you can see psychopathic or narcissistic traits among people that wind up in powerful roles, because those qualities can be seen as leaderly. And it can also draw us to love partners, for example, that look powerful and leaderly and attractive, but who also are prone to violence.
Right.
So it's very difficult to tease apart those factors.
Yeah, I think that's really good. So they're really, I mean, there's some varying relationships, aren't there, between psychosis, psychopathy, sadism, narcissism, violent crimes, isn't there?
Yes. The idea is that when you're thinking about a given offense, the idea is to first ask yourself, what are the external factors that were playing upon the individual so that irrespective of personality, the person might have acted out violently. And in fact, Michael Stone and I have worked together to develop a scale that he initially proposed, a 20-category scale that sort of looks at these factors to determine how much was coming from the personality and how much was coming from external factors. Right?
It's really, interesting piece. Yeah, it is. You talk about that 22-level gradations of evil scale, and created by your colleague you both use it, Dr. Michael Stone, and he says it was inspired by Dante's Circle of Hell, but made up of the murderers in the 20th century. And you're saying it helps work to understand why someone may act out in violent ways, ranging maybe even from a lower level of violence that we might all understand, to some degree, let's say self-defense or acts of passion, to the more heinous and, of violent expressions. Lean into the scale a bit more with us and tell us about the algorithms behind how it's used.
Sure. So the scale was originally developed by Michael Stone, a 22-category system, and it was popularized on a television program he had on Investigation Discovery called Most Evil, and he described it in a book, Anatomy of Evil. This was a classic. And at the time, the scale had categories that I think were a little difficult to tease apart in terms of clear profiles that could be used perhaps in conceptualizing clinically, but it was a wonderful scale. And what it did was it helped establish the idea that many of the seemingly separate categories that are described, for example, in the DSM and so forth, like narcissism, psychopathy, might be conceptualized as existing along a spectrum that begins with narcissism and moves through varying degrees of psychopathy, so that sadism represents the culmination or the worst, the highest in that scale. And then when I came along, Michael and I began working together quite a number of years ago now. The idea was to hone it and develop it into a system where there were clear, concise distinctions between groups, that violent offenses other than just homicide or murder could be placed into the scale easily, and that you might wind up with distinct categories that could be used even in research, right? Because that's the angle I'm always trying to think about, ways of researching violent crime. And so the scale, in a nutshell, that has 6 categories in the beginning that are things that wouldn't necessarily evoke the feeling of evil in us because they reflect reactions to adverse life events that anybody could understand. Juries tend to understand. For example, things like self-defense, like acting out of abuse and a need to get out of a certain situation, extreme jealous rage, like walking in on your lover with somebody else, that kind of thing. Now, those categories, just to give you an example, what a scale proposes is that the same outside issue can affect 2 different people, but depending upon the personality structure of the individual, they might react to it differently. So, in this first part of the scale, if a person walks in on his or her lover with somebody and acts out of totally impetuous, blind rage, right? No planning,
Right.
no torture, no like playing this out, nothing. Then the jury can understand a crime of passion. People can understand a crime of passion. However,
Really,
there
it's kind of more,
is
kind of more impulsive, really, in
more
those
impulse,
moments.
exactly.
Yeah.
And but higher on the scale, there is a category for jealous lovers who methodically plot over periods of time
Right.
to get revenge because of a need to level the playing field or so forth.
Right.
So
Please.
2 cases, Samuel Collins, a man in Maine, infamous case where he was quite in love with his significant other, went to visit her at a supermarket where she worked, found her kissing a coworker, waited for her at home, blinded with rage, and wound up stabbing her to death and attempting to kill himself. By comparison, there is the infamous case of Els Ploteman, a woman in Belgium who was in a love triangle with a man and a woman with whom she was in a skydiving team. And one day was on a couch at home. She overheard him with the other woman in the other room, and she severed the release cords on the parachute of the other woman.
Oh
And,
my.
and when they went for a jump, she filmed on her helmet, she had a camera, she filmed the other woman fumbling to her death multiple miles. Now, there is an enormous difference between those 2 cases, both
Yes.
motivated by jealousy, but the first,
Yeah.
which falls in the first part of the scale, was what the French would call the crime passionnel, the crime of passion, whereas the second is a more plotted, methodical,
Yes.
cruel thing. So, first part of the scale are those kind of situational factors without the presence of personality features that would make a person prone to repeat offend, right? Probably a one-time event in a person's life. You then move into the portion of the scale that talks about the influence of things like narcissism or the need for attention or the complete control of another human being, where there isn't full psychopathy, but we see offenses there that involve things like killing a celebrity, so the 2 of you will become, forever tied together, repeatedly killing one's own children to get attention because you like the reaction people have at a funeral to you and the sympathy they give you. Certain acts of cannibalism where the idea is that the offender feels that they're making the other human being part of themselves permanently, certain acts like that. And then we move into various crimes we won't get into in detail, but all different subtypes of crime that are increasingly motivated by needs for control, power, domination, cruelty, until we wind up through these distinct categories at the upper end, category 22, where there is the presence of extreme protracted torture, repeat murder, and typically sexual assault in addition. And here we are, of course, well into the category of serial offender, a serial killer, because the person is so driven at that point by personality needs and fantasy that you have to picture someone that's something like a person making a movie, living out a fantasy in his head, right? And I say his because they're almost always male,
Yeah.
in his head, right? So that the point is to go out and find victims that best fit that fantasy and to keep over and over and over again enacting it until it's perfect in their head. And it never satisfies the fantasy, so they do it over and over and over. And what happens for an individual like that is that the crime is ultimately purely motivated by fantasies and features of the personality. And the person has no reason to stop. If they were let out of prison, they have no intention whatsoever of quitting it.
Right.
It is simply who the person chooses to be.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Most of us spend more time at work than anywhere else doing anything else. So why not spend that time in a job you love? Introducing Triad's Jobs Marketplace, the only job site dedicated specifically to behavioral and mental health professionals. Featuring more than 1,000 open jobs from dozens of behavioral and mental health employers, and searchable by location, professional field, employment type, specialization, and more. Jobs Marketplace helps you find your next career opportunity. Full-time, part-time, or gig time, make the most of your time. To access Jobs Marketplace, register for your free professional account at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT, and then click to Jobs Marketplace. If you're already a member of the Triad community, visit app.hellotriad.com/jobs. That's app.hellotriad.com/jobs. Visit us today and take your next career step tomorrow.
You know, as you talk about the scale and the various cases you're sharing with us, you're suggesting this field of study is not just a good one to study, but something that would be an imperative, really, inquiry into this. So the scale is used to understand the motive behind a crime and also how to help develop a better understanding of the criminal. How might and how is this being translated into assisting with and possibly aiding in either the capture of or the prevention of future crimes from occurring?
Well, first of all, I'm often consulted, and Michael is certainly consulted by people who are working with offenders, or, for example, right now I might be working with a detective or someone who is thinking about a certain way to ask questions to a suspect, or, you know, to sort of get at motive and the psychology behind. And where I think it helps is to take the position that whether we're talking about psychosis or we're talking about violent crime, it's important to remember that most people are not illogical.
Yes.
People that are grossly using drugs or alcohol and totally disorganized, this is a very rare thing, right? Not guilty by reason of insanity because they had absolutely no idea what they were doing or ability to appreciate right from wrong. This is very, very rare. For the rest, there typically is a logic. But the trouble is that the premise is not known to the outside. So the logic, we don't see that the logic flows from a certain premise that is either delusional or the delusional is idiosyncratic and rooted in the person's personality. So what I do, whether it's my psychosis work or my violence work, is I try to get to that bedrock premise. And in the scale, what attracted me to it from the get-go is that it is also based on the notion that in order to understand the offense, first, you have to understand the outside factors. Those are the earliest individuals in the scale, or where that becomes most important. But then you have to understand what is the person doing by doing this crime? What is the need or the bedrock factor that is being served? And if that thing is part of a person's psychological makeup in a deep, long-standing way, chances are you will see signs and indications of that across a lifespan, where it ultimately gets acted out, typically because of some life event or use of drugs or alcohol to disinhibit the person, or getting to a certain age where they finally act it out. But the point is that you should see signs of that are longstanding, and you should also see that people, their affect, their emotion, expression on their face and so forth lights up when you talk about it. I will often advise people that have to go in and talk to an offender to watch the reactions, the body reactions and the excitement and so forth on the person's face, because these things will be so tied in. And we can also see in individuals like this who are deeply visual people that sometimes many, many years after the offense, they can still visualize it the way that we can remember things like the day we were married or the day our first child was born. You remember the serial killer Samuel Little, who passed away recently. He was the most prolific serial killer in American history. Samuel Little was capable, decades after killing his victims, to draw them as if they were in front of him. He could remember the jewelry they were wearing, the looks on their faces, the clothing they were wearing, where they were, what the weather was like. He was capable of remembering everything like that because it was the fulfillment of a long-standing fantasy.
I would love to kind of flag for our next show together, going a little bit more in depth with what is the need that comes to be understood that stirs or is being met or satiated in these acts, and how to understand that piece, because there is meaning to it. It's not a random, always impulsive thing. Sometimes it is, but for the most part, it's not. There's something being met in that. So let's flag that for next time when we get to come back, and we can tap into your expertise around that piece as well.
That's what the scale helps us to understand.
Yes. Yeah.
Motivation behind the subcategories. What I will say in brief is, in general terms, when an offender is repeatedly committing either sexual assault or homicide, there are generally four kind of overarching themes that you see, right? Where it's a repeat thing based on the personality. So for example, if we're talking about serial murder, the four general categories that you see are: the widest category is serial sexual homicide, right? An individual that is motivated by the need to control or dominate through sexual acts, repeated victims over and over again, right? And there could sometimes be acts of real butchery or torture present there also. The second category that you see are people that have no sexual motivation, but have a kind of a general loathing, a seething rage towards a certain group or the general population. So we can see offenders like the Zodiac Killer or the Unabomber or something that have no sexual motivations, but kill repeatedly because of some philosophy or anger or loathing. Then there are what are called angels of death, that are nurses or doctors that repeatedly kill patients because of the godlike feelings that they get for killing. And they like being the one who is there when the code is called and the person is dying. And I was the first doctor or nurse on the scene.
Yeah.
And the fourth category are mothers, generally, who commit, typically because of Munchausen's by proxy, repeat infanticide, killing of children because of the attention that is received from the offense. And that's typically done about a year apart, generally between the infanticides. Those four wide categories are what we see in people that repeatedly kill. And one can get into a very long discussion about the various psychological motivations, but those are the four wide categories.
Got it. Let's flag those as we're talking about. Maybe we can kind of weave those into our next talk together. I'm also thinking about the difference between serial murders and mass murders. In addition to your research and your writings, I grew up in Pasadena, California. Back in the 70s, the Hillside Strangler, or Stranglers as we know, the two cousins, were terrorizing Los Angeles, and they killed about 10 women in total. And we know that the serial killings seem to have peaked for one reason or another in the 80s, but in the past several decades, there's been a relative decline, with only just about, I understand, about 100 serial killers being identified in the last decade. And what I know about the mass murders too is that they really make an impact on society. Although they tend to actually account for only a small fraction of the annual worldwide murders, they do make an impact on our society. Yeah. What do you think is explaining this shift from serial to mass murders?
Well, before one can answer that question, it's important to understand that there was also a shift towards increased serial killing that came in the 1960s in the Western. So that one has to understand that the violent offense du jour, of the day, is going to be very related to what's going on in a given culture. Now, in the book I did with Michael Stone, The New Evil, we talked quite a bit about what the cultural factors are that we believe might have led to this gross explosion of serial killing in the Western world from the 1960s onward. But when you understand the motivations for that, you start to understand why there's a shift towards mass murder now. Now, mass murder became much more common in the United States, especially since approximately the time of the Columbine killing, about 1999, 2000. From then onward, there was a real increase in that. And from the 90s onward, there's been a decline in serial killing. Now, one theory for that is that it has to do with the growing ability of law enforcement to capture people more quickly, right, before they become a repeat offender. And there are probably plenty of one-time or two-time killers in prison that if they were let out would go right back because they're motivated by the kinds of personality features that we talked about, right? It's not a one-time thing for them. But the other thing is that it has to do with the certain cultural needs at a given time. Michael Stone and I have proposed, for example, that one of the reasons for the explosion of serial sexual homicide, aggression towards women in the 1960s onward, was a backlash on the part of certain working class men against the freedoms that women were receiving at the time, which, by the way, is a wonderful thing. But the loss of power and control was very difficult for some males at the time. And we see that as the root of that. Now, what has happened is that we've seen more of an acceptance of women having that freedom. There may be a sort of alteration in where hostilities are going. And what we see with mass murder is mass murder. First of all, it's impossible to have a discussion about mass murder without understanding its relationship with the wide and easy availability of semi-automatic weaponry, because semi-automatic weaponry became widely available to the public in the 1970s. And what's interesting about it is that there was about 20 years or so where those things were widely available, but they were less used in violent crime than they were starting in the late 90s onward. In other words, it was a growing number of times they were used, but there was just this sort of very serious explosion about 1999 onward. Why? Well, first of all, you have to understand that the root of most mass murder seems to be individuals who kind of can't cope with certain catastrophic adverse life events. The individual has something that for him or her is central to their existence, a loved one, a romantic partner, a school, a job, a political belief, whatever. Right. When that thing faces dissolution, the person loses his or her ability to have a sense of identity, because that thing has been pulled away. They act out. And so you see people who do things like, I'm upset that my wife left me, so I go to work and I shoot 5 people and so forth. Yeah. Now, the problem is that we have to ask ourselves what is going on in the culture that has reduced us to individuals where identity is that fragile, where the sense of the purpose of existence is so fragile that we have nothing left but this one little tiny thing that gives us our entire sense of purpose. And in addition, that crossed with the wide availability of semi-automatic weapons and the massive amounts of attention that one receives when committing an act of spectacular violence on social media and so forth, it creates a very dangerous loop. And I will tell you that I believe that the particular political and sort of psychological pool of factors that we're swimming in for the past several years in particular is quite dangerous in terms of the risk factors for mass murder. The wide availability of semi-automatic firearms, the economic decline, the splits in politics, the people longing for more black and white identity, etc., it's all quite a dangerous mixture. And the pandemic has created all kinds of adverse life events for people psychologically. And then we have the fragment of mass murder that is driven by serious mental illness, which is all fragment.
There are really some perfect storms in there, aren't there?
The perfect storm, and I'm not surprised. I had been saying a year before the recent uptick that we're seeing in January that I was very nervous about the coming period, and indeed we are seeing the uptick.
Yeah, Gary, in your work in this field, to include, I know we're kind of coming home here in this podcast today, but in all of your work in this field, to include, your 50 articles and the books you've been involved with, is there a case? I'm not looking necessarily for specifics here, but is there a case or a specific aspect of this work that stands out to you as unique or particularly intriguing or fascinating or even difficult for you to get your mind around?
Well, I think the most difficult thing about it for me is that what has made me sort of stand out in my ability to help people that are trying to analyze or understand offenses is that I need to step into the psychology of the offender.
Yes.
It sometimes means trying to apply a logic or a humanity to people that, by my own definition with Michael Stone, are unfathomable. So that one has to sort of enter into the darkness of saying, if I were this individual, why would I have done X? And I think that what makes these things, quote unquote, evil and unfathomable to people is that they cannot do that or they don't wish to. And what is also very difficult is that you can sometimes get to know a violent offender and sometimes even like them. You remember, for example, in Cold Blood, where Truman Capote came to be quite fond of a man who was one of 2 that committed a home invasion and a mass murder, right? And was very heartbroken to see him executed. So there is this sort of strange thing of the ability to humanize the word that I think is very difficult. And the other answer to that question would be when you see the actual effects, when you leave the media and sort of go into a case and see the faces of the family members who are hearing about what happened to their child or their loved one or so forth, and you really understand the effect of evil goes well beyond the crime and into society and family itself.
That's right.
That you really get, why it is that, for example, the word diabolical has its root in a Greek term that means to tear asunder. Right. That's really what it is. It is a fragmentation, a ripping apart that it is impossible to balance out ever again. The best we can do is to try to understand and prevent those horrors in the future.
As you put it that way, and with regard to all violent crime, let's say of all sorts, what is your prediction, and what might you kind of speak to for us in the U.S. here for the next 5 years, and what might we want to take into consideration about where things could go if we don't get a handle on some of the things you talked about just a few minutes back?
Well, I think the problem is that we're increasingly a culture that does not introspect and does not realize that the things we do are rooted in particular philosophical beliefs. One of the things that has happened since the 1960s is that in the postmodern world, we've moved away from certain modes of thought, religious ideas, philosophical ideas, so forth, that gave us a black and white sense of identity. Now, irrespective of what one believes about those things, the point is that those things can serve as a kind of glue. And there are certain more brittle people who cannot handle a world in which things are not black and white. They don't like that. The idea that, you want everything to sort of be walled off and kind of concrete and so forth. And what happens is that, if you have a culture that is not able to look inward at its fears, that can be manipulated, by the way, if it's not willing to look at its fears and the psychology driving it, it places it at danger, risk of acting out, because it's not using higher parts of its brain.
Yeah, that's really good.
It's just sort of acting out of amygdala, And that's so right. You want to be wary of people who are smart enough to come along and say, if the average person is operating on a fear factor, let me stir that fear up. That's and right. Play upon their ideas and cause more splits in society. Yeah. And then people, before you know it, are hating each other or forming teams and so forth. When in reality, right now, our enemy should probably be the coronavirus. And we should be joining up to battle it.
Absolutely.
But anyway, but I think the unexamined self is always at risk of acting out.
I really appreciate that. Hey, Gary, as we kind of bring it home for today, I'd like you, if you would, just please to draw us to some resources that you'd recommend, as well as referencing your book, The New Evil. Give us some things to take a look at post our show today.
Well, I think The New Evil is I'm quite proud of the book because I think it did a very good job of laying out a system that can be followed by the average person, even if he or she has no training or background whatsoever in forensics or criminology. And it'll also help you understand not only real life offenders, but offenders that are depicted in movies and television shows and books, arch villains and things like that. It's also something of a good crash course in the history of concepts like psychopathy and serial killing and mass murder and things like that. And we'll describe what is meant by new evil and how there are certain offenses that couldn't happen prior to the past 50 to 60 years because the technology didn't exist or because there are cultural changes that are disinhibiting parts of the self that normally would have been inhibited in our culture. And other resources that I think are quite good are previous work by certain people like, for example, Michael Stone's first book, The Anatomy of Evil, an excellent primer on the concept of evil. I would have a look at the works of John Douglas, who the readers would know from Mindhunter, particularly his books on motive, like Anatomy of Motive or Obsession. Very, very good books that lay out subtypes of violent offenses. And I would also have a look at the works of Anne Burgess, who is, we mentioned her earlier, depicted on Mindhunter also, particularly her book on motives and patterns of sexual homicide. Is really a landmark book. And finally, if one is interested in the subject of psychopathy, the key people to read would be Robert Hare, who was, of course, at the helm of the psychopathy checklist and sort of conceptualizing psychopathy and helping us understand why the DSM category of antisocial personality disorder doesn't really work to capture a true psychopath very well. And I would also look at Keckley, right? Harvey Keckley, the Mask of Sanity, which is one of the early and great books on the subject of psychopathy. So those would be some great resources, I think, just starting.
Hey, Gary, I appreciate the resources and really appreciate the time with you today. What an interesting and fascinating field, and your inputs and the way that you kind of come at this really offer a tremendous perspective. I so look forward to having you back on the show. Oh, sure. So thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Hey, and to those of you listening in today, I want to thank you as well for being with us, and we'll look forward to having you next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Tribe Network, all rights reserved.